There's a Midrash Tanchuma on the Pasuk Vayikra Moshe. Hashem called to Moshe. Omer Avasi, Ger shekibel olav kol ator kula chutz midover echod. Also, a convert who's agreeable to accept the whole Torah in its entirety except one thing, he's not eligible for conversion. He has to be agreeable to accept the Torah in its entirety. Even something which is a small detail of the Torah or something even rabbinic, if he's not willing, agreeable to accept it, he's not eligible for conversion. This is the point I want to make. There's a mitzvah regarding a ger. You should not afflict a convert. You should love a convert. But there are 48 mitzvahs in the Torah which relate to laws pertaining to a convert. How he should be treated, regarding charity, many things. But it's mentioned 48 times in the Torah. And when the Torah speaks about idolatry in the Torah, the idolatry is mentioned 48 times in the Torah regarding prohibitions which relate to idolatry. So we have two sides of the equation. Conversion side, the ger is mentioned 48 times. On the pagan side, idolatry side, it's mentioned 48 times. What is the correlation between the positive and the negative? Omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Dayo shiniach avodah zara bo etzlechem. Isn't it enough that he abandoned idolatry and he came to you to become part of Jewish people? Therefore, I command you, you must love him. Because what he did, the value of his severing his relation with idolatry to become part of you, that's considered a monumental accomplishment. Therefore, I command you, you must love him for what he had done. Yeah. And why? The reason why I'm commanding you to love him, because I love him. Shenemar v'oev ger losis lo lechem v'simlo. Quotes a pasuk in the Torah. He loves the ger to give him lechem v'simlo, bread and a garment. So the reason why we have an obligation to love the ger, it's not only because he did something monumental. Hashem says, I want you to love him because I love him. Therefore, you must love him. And so we find this corresponding number 48 times laws pertaining to the convert, loving him, giving him, treating him specially, and 48 times idolatry is mentioned in Torah. Okay? Now, we find by Moshe Rabbeinu, when Yisro had come out, had abandoned all his glory and gone out to the desert, Yisro sends a message to Moshe Rabbeinu that I'm coming, and if you're agreeable to come out to greet me, fine. Not, you should come out to greet your wife. And if you're not agreeable to come out to greet your wife, you should come out to greet your two children who are with us. And we find Moshe Rabbeinu goes out himself, greets Moshe, Moshe greets Yisro, and who follows Moshe? Aaron and his children, the elders, and the greatest honor that was accorded any human being in the history, besides Yaakov Avinu, was Yisro, because all Klal Yisrael went out to greet Yisro. But what was the original hesitation? What was Moshe? What Yisro understood? There's a chance Moshe may not go out to greet him or his wife, but his children, yes. So the way we explain, so over there, the Midrash tells us, Hashem says to Moshe, you go greet him. The reason why you go greet him is because what Yisro had done, who was a pagan priest, one of the greatest pagan priests in the world, since he abandoned his idolatry to become part of the Jewish people, you must value him for himself. It's the same idea. To be able to sever your relationship with idolatry for the sake of God, this is considered something very significant, something monumental. Therefore, but again, it doesn't say over there, because since I love him, you must love him. That we see from the Midrash here. Because Hashem says, I value the convert, because he gave up the idolatry to become a monotheist. Therefore, you must love him, because I love him. So what's the reason why you must love the convert? You could say because when he did something so special. And the indication of how special it is, because Hashem says, I love him. That is the proof of how special it is, because Hashem wouldn't love him otherwise. And if I love him, that tells you it's something special. Or maybe you'll say there's this concept of Mahu Afato, because we must emulate Hashem. And whatever Hashem does to have that relation with him, we must emulate his relationship or the way he conducts himself in this existence, his attributes, whether it's mercy, graciousness, or whatever it may be. But the number is 48. We find Mishnah Pirkei Avos, Memches Dvorim Shator Niklas Bahem. The Torah is acquired with 48 ways. 48 ways. The 48, you have to have 48 involvements, behavior patterns, or experiences to acquire the Torah, its entirety. The number is 48. So you'd say it happened 48 times, but what's significant in the number 48? So we find over here, this Midrash tells us, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Shalom says that idolatry is mentioned 48 times in the Torah. Now, the Torah itself, what is the only antidote to be able to counter the evil, the negative? The evil inclination, the only thing that could incapacitate him is the study of Torah. That's the tavlin. That is the antidote. So the Torah is the corresponding factor to the evil inclination. But what is the ultimate level of evil in existence? The ultimate evil is what? Is denial of God. That's idolatry, paganism. So since we find paganism mentioned 48 times in the Torah, Avodah Zorah, and that's why the Ger, his accomplishments is such a monumental feat. Therefore, loving the Ger is mentioned 48 times in the Torah. And the only antidote to deal with that paganism, which is the ultimate level of Yetzer Hara, evil inclination, is the Torah. Therefore, how does one acquire the Torah? The 48 involvements, 40 levels of development or experience or exposure you have to be able to acquire the Torah, to be able to ultimately have control over yourself, to be able to deal with the counterforce, which is the Yetzer Hara. That's the corresponding factor of 48 versus 48. That's what the Torah is. The Memches Dvorim Shator Niklas Bahem. We became God's people. How did we become God's people? Through the giving of the Torah. And the Torah itself is the only way to contend with the evil inclination, to encompass the evil inclination, meaning the evil of the Eitz Hadas, which became integrated in our being, came about through the sin of the eating of the tree of knowledge of Adam. At Sinai, we had said at the time we were exposed to the Shekhinah at Sinai, we reverted back to pre-Sinai, to pre-sin of Adam. When God gave the Torah at Sinai, what was at stake at that moment? What was at stake at that moment? Evil understood if the Jews succeed and don't fail with idolatry, that means evil is purged and expunged and removed from existence forever. That was at stake at that moment. So what was the issue? What was the struggle at that moment? The struggle was idolatry. If idolatry could rear its head and be reinstituted at that moment, that means the evil itself has reestablished itself. The evil had been unrooted at that moment, and there was a question now whether it would be totally removed from existence. But what removed that evil from existence? It was the Torah at Sinai. The evil inclination came as Satan, and he convinced the Jews that Moshe Rabbeinu died. As Rashi cites over there in Kisisa, the world became dark, and the Jews saw Moshe's remains being carried in heaven. And he convinced them that Moshe was dead, had died. Therefore, they said, we need an intermediary. We need an intermediary, which is what? We have to serve a deity, which is the eagle, which was the golden calf. But it's always idolatry, because the idolatry is the ultimate counterforce to the Torah itself, as it says, 48 verses 8. The ger is mentioned 48 times, idolatry is mentioned 48 times. And as we said, and how does one acquire Torah? The 48 levels of experience and exposure and development you need to acquire Torah, to be fully in control of your behavior, and only then could you counter fully idolatry. You know, the Gemara tells us in Shabbos, Kol hakoes kilu oed avodah zarah. We spoke about this in the Mitzvos Hasharim. Anger is the Rambam says, is one of the most negative characteristics a person could possess, anger. Why? Because when a person becomes angry, we're speaking about extremely angry, at that moment, you're no longer a rational human being. You've lost your senses. And when you lose your senses, there's no telling what you could do. And therefore, the Gemara tells us, Hashova kelim chamoso, a person who starts smashing vessels when he's angry, that means he's really, really lost it. He's out of control. Kilo oved avodah zarah. We see him at that moment as if he's doing idolatry. Why? So the Gemara says, because when a person's out of control, there's no telling where he could go. And he can even go to the point of doing idolatry when he becomes angry. But idolatry, that's the most extreme. That's the extreme always. Kol hakoes. Now, if anger itself has this negative side to it, that it could unseat the person, unhinge the person to go to idolatry, that's the ultimate. So therefore, anger is something a person has to contend with. Because as we see over here, anger is the antithesis of what? Idolatry is the antithesis of Torah. The whole concept of Torah is what? Is control. The only way we could be fully in control, to have choice, is only when we have Torah. When you engage in Torah, now you're in control. Now you have a certain degree of clarity that you're able to make decisions. The moment you become angry, you lose control. The moment you become unhinged, the Torah already now is in question because you no longer have the clarity, you no longer have the focus. The moment you don't have the focus, where do you gravitate towards? You gravitate towards idolatry. Because the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, always wants to draw you there, because that is the antithesis of the Torah, as the Torah itself, as we just pointed out. Idolatry is mentioned 48 times in the Torah. Loving the ger is mentioned 48 times in the Torah. The Mishnah Pirkei Avos tells us only through 48 ways do you acquire the Torah, because that's the only way you take full control of your life, is only through the study of Torah in its fullest sense, which is 48 ways to acquire it, to be fully in possession of the Torah itself. Bring this back on. The root of anger is arrogance. I have a right. What sets a person off? What sets a person off is it doesn't go your way. It's a degree of frustration. Didn't I tell you? Why didn't you listen? And therefore, if I did tell you, because I feel if I told you, you should listen. And if it doesn't go my way, you become upset. Why do you become upset? Because there's an entitlement. You believe it should go your way and you should be right. A person himself tries to figure something out. He's not even dealing with anyone else. And he can't figure out the difficulty. And he becomes frustrated. And in a state of frustration, a person becomes slightly agitated. Why? because it reflects on yourself and it puts your ego in question that you're not capable of accomplishing this. You believe you should be able to accomplish it, to figure it out or to work it out, and you can't work it out. Because based on your perception of yourself, you believe you could and you should. If you can't, it reflects on a certain failing within yourself. Therefore, it creates frustration, which is anger. Therefore, you have a short fuse at that moment. Now, why did Adam eat of the tree of knowledge? This is a very important point. Nobody had clarity like Adam. He saw from one end of the world to the other. Hashem says, don't eat of the tree of knowledge. He ate of the tree of knowledge. He had to have some degree of justification. Even though Hashem says, don't, he justified. Why did he justify it? So I always mention the name of the Arizal. The Arizal says that since it tells us in Pirkei Avos, the Mishnah tells us, L'fum tzara agro, that the greater the challenge, the greater is the accomplishment. Adam says, at this point, I have absolute clarity. What I'm going to do is create some level of doubt within myself that I don't have that clarity. And despite that, I'll make the right decision. And that's why he ate. That was the basis why he ate of the tree of knowledge. So God says to him, why did you eat? He says, I'm not looking for heroes. I asked you not to eat. I'm not asking you to increase the degree of challenge so your level of accomplishment should be greater. The answer is because that was Adam's own spin on how we should serve God. God says, look, I never told you to serve me that way. Simple and easy. But again, it was the ego. I want to have my own input. This is my brand of service of God. So where does it emanate from? Everything starts from ego. That's the gaiva. If God says no, how do you say yes? Well, because I see it a little differently and I can do it even better. But God doesn't want you to do it better. You always want to have your stamp of your own identity that it's me, including God. So ultimately, when they did idolatry at Sinai, what did they revert back to? They reverted back to sin, pre-sin, post-sin. Because if God, they heard God say, Anochi Hashem Elokecha Hotzitzicha me'eretz Mitzrayim, lo yochal Elohim acher aponai. Idolatry is forbidden. What's the consideration? Because they had a question. But Moshe Rabbeinu was not here. Although it was only a false impression by Sot, doesn't make a difference. But if you would have been committed and negated to God's will and understand it's impossible, we're going to idolatry. We're not fully faulted for it because the rabble encouraged it. But what's even the consideration? The answer is because there's always that aspect of ego. We don't understand. It seems to be, according to our understanding, Moshe is no longer alive. And somehow that's why they gravitated there. It always goes back to the ego. And therefore, always humility is always the foundation of service of Hashem. And that's why when we speak about Moshe Rabbeinu's greatness, Moshe is never referred to as tzaddik or chassid. Moshe is referred to as Eved Hashem. Onav mikol adam. The characteristic which encompassed Moshe Rabbeinu, which tells you everything about him, he was the most humble person who ever walked the face of the earth. There was no trace of ego within him. Whatever he did was purely for the sake of God, because he had negated himself totally to the will of Hashem. Mark, go ahead.
What was the ego